In 1865, the Civil War had ended, changing many lives, especially those of color. Thousands of former slaves were now freed into the world, a world they had never seen. Although this change opened various doors, hardly any African Americans had the skills they needed to survive. Majority of African Americans had worked for others their whole lives, learning only what they needed. Less than 1% of the newly freed people owned the home in which they lived in or the land it stood on, leaving them in devastation. Trying hard to make a living, African Americans searched for new jobs, often leaving their families for weeks in the process. Almost all African Americans lacked the skills that employers desired, and with little money, times had worsened. In the South, families were trapped in an endless cycle of debt as sharecroppers and being promised land that had not yet materialized. Things began piling up, one catastrophe after another. In the 1890s, the cotton crops throughout the region had been damaged, cutting off a large provider and helping to gain money. All of these events pushed blacks to seek better lives, no matter the circumstances. After World War I ended in 1918, stock markets crashed, leaving employers desperate for hands. Seeing this as a chance, thousands of African Americans moved to larger cities hoping for a better life. More and more blacks began moving up to the north in the 1900s to the 1920s, although getting a job was not easy. Unfortunately, employers in the north did not welcome blacks with open arms. White laborers complained that blacks were flooding employment markets and stealing jobs. African Americans targeted big cities such as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Illinois, and Harlem, New York. Chicago's population went from 44,000 citizens to 234,000 citizens, while Philadelphia's went from 84,000 to 220,000 citizens. But the city that attracted the most travelers was the city of Harlem, New York, changing drastically from 100,000 citizens to 235,000 citizens. This shift in the African American population became known as the Great Migration. Having survived the hardships of the South, devastating changes, and punishments based on race, African Americans began to feel confidence in themselves and their abilities. This spark began the blossoming of the Harlem Renaissance. For the very first time, African American musicians, artists, and writers were renowned for their outstanding performances, sculptures, and literature. The city of Harlem in particular attracted great musicians, writers, and artists such as Louis Armstrong, Langston Hughes, Augusta Savage, Duke Ellington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Cab Calloway. Harlem became the epicenter of an artistic explosion, spreading throughout not only the black culture, but the white culture as well. Whites began taking a certain interest in the new era of arts, cheering on performances held at the all-famous Cotton Club. Louis Armstrong, a large influence to jazz musicians, performed regularly, booking shows and attracting audiences. Creating a number of top hits such as Dinah, After You're Gone, and of course, What a Wonderful World. Another famed musician of the time was Duke Ellington and his orchestra. Ellington was known throughout the era for his outstanding composing skills and ability to play the piano, his career spanning over 50 years. His song, It Don't Mean a Thing, introduced Harlem to the art of swing and became largely popular.
Don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. It don't mean a thing, all you gotta do is swing.
As well as Ellington's Mood Indigo, giving audiences a sense of relaxation and lusciousness. Which brings us to an artist with a similar music style, Cab Calloway. Calloway was a character who was full of energy, creating jazz and interesting pieces guaranteed to get his audiences on their feet. He created songs such as Heidi Ho Man, Minnie the Moocher, and Calloway Boogie.
Here's a little song I'd like to do for you. There's nothing to it, it's easy to do. Call it the Calloway Boogie. Calloway Boogie. Calloway Boogie. Calloway Boogie. Keeps you groovy 24 hours a day. You like music with the boogie beat? Dig this jive jag zoom. The Calloway Boogie. Calloway Boogie. Calloway Boogie. Calloway Boogie. Keeps you groovy 24 hours a day.
Armstrong, Ellington, and Calloway were all a huge part of the movement, making jazz what it is today. But jazz wasn't the only center of this cultural movement. One very talented woman changed the public's view on art. Augusta Savage, born on February 29, 1892, began her love of art at a very young age, fighting racism to win a place for black women in the art world. In the 1920s, Savage received the opportunity to create a sculpture for W.E.B. Du Bois, another great influence of the Harlem Renaissance. She became an inspiration to black women everywhere, and even founding the Savage Studio of Arts and Crafts in Harlem in 1932. Speaking of arts, literature became huge in Harlem, rising many writers and poets to fame, such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes, who, later in their career, worked together. Born on February 23, 1868, William Edward Bogart Du Bois was destined for greatness. He became the first African American to earn a Ph.D. from the highly educational Harvard University. During Du Bois's lifetime, he co-founded the NAACP, otherwise known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and served as the editor of the NAACP's monthly magazine, The Crisis, which became widely popular, gaining more than 100,000 readers.
So I came up and, after some difficulty, persuaded them to let me found the Crisis magazine, a little monthly magazine which would discuss the Negro problem and which would tell white people and colored people just what the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was and what it proposed to do. Well, the magazine was founded in November 1910, and I edited it for 23 years. And in that time, I think I made the people of the United States, and especially the colored people, realize just what the Negro problem was and what they had got to do to solve it.
W.E.B. Du Bois later became introduced to James Langston Hughes, another poet and writer of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes became known for his signature poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which connects the past of African Americans to some of the world's greatest rivers. This poem eventually became his signature piece, which led him to the introduction of W.E.B. Du Bois. The stock markets crashed after Black Tuesday in 1929. The country began to fall into what is known as the Great Depression. The Harlem Renaissance began to fade, and many people were left unemployed. The places that were booming with cultural vibrance had died down. But by then, the impact of this cultural blossoming had opened doors that were inaccessible to African Americans worldwide, doors that would carry out the new generation.